By noon on March 15, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was dead, stabbed 23 times by his own senators in what would become the most famous assassination in history. But here's the twisted thing: Caesar's murder wasn't unusual, it was Tuesday in Rome. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another deep dive into history's darkest corners. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now settle in, get comfortable, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's dive into the bloody, bizarre world of Roman lunch hour executions, where being emperor meant you had a higher chance of dying violently than a gladiator in the arena. The Roman Empire lasted over 500 years, and in that time they had roughly 80 emperors, depending on how you count the usurpers, co-emperors, and guys who held power for about as long as it takes to order takeout. Of those 80 emperors, at least 30 were murdered. That's nearly 40%, which makes being Roman emperor statistically more dangerous than being a test pilot or a bomb disposal expert. But here's what's really strange: most of these murders happened during the day, often around meal times. Why? Because Romans, like most ancient people, ate their main meal around midday, and nothing says vulnerability like a man with a mouth full of wine and roasted peacock trying to digest while wearing a toga that could trip you up in a light breeze. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers supposedly protecting the emperor, became the biggest threat to imperial life. They were like the Secret Service, except instead of taking a bullet for the president, they were usually the ones firing it. These weren't random acts of violence either. They were carefully planned political operations, often funded by senators who wanted a new emperor or by ambitious generals who thought they could do better. And the methods were creative. Caligula was stabbed 30 times by his own guards who had grown tired of his increasingly insane demands, like making his horse a consul. Claudius was probably poisoned by his wife Agrippina, who used a mushroom dish to clear the path for her son Nero. Domitian was stabbed by a freedman in his bedroom after a conspiracy involving his wife, his chamberlain, and half the palace staff. Commodus, the emperor who thought he was Hercules reborn, was strangled in his bath by an athlete named Narcissus after surviving poisoned wine that only made him vomit. The Romans had turned regicide into an art form. But why were so many emperors murdered during lunch or afternoon hours? The answer lies in Roman daily schedules and the strange vulnerability of absolute power. Romans typically woke before dawn, conducted business in the morning, then had their main meal around noon, followed by a siesta or light afternoon activities. This was when emperors were most relaxed, most trusting, and most accessible. They'd dismiss some guards, eat with friends and family, or conduct informal meetings. It was the ancient equivalent of letting your guard down. And assassins knew this. Lunch was when the emperor's food could be poisoned, when his wine could be doctored, when his dining companions could pull daggers from their togas. It was when servants had access to him, when guards rotated shifts, and when the formal protocols of the morning gave way to casual afternoon routines. The Praetorian Guard, who were supposed to be the emperor's ultimate protection, became the ultimate threat because they had the best access. They knew the emperor's schedule, his habits, his weaknesses. They ate with him, traveled with him, slept near him. And when they decided he had to go, they didn't need to storm the palace. They were already inside. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, died of natural causes while on campaign, but his son Commodus, who succeeded him, lasted 12 years before the Praetorians had enough. Commodus thought he was the reincarnation of Hercules and forced senators to watch him fight in gladiatorial games, which was like forcing Congress to watch the president wrestle alligators on live television. The conspiracy against him involved his mistress Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect Laetus. They tried poison first, slipping it into his wine during his evening meal, but Commodus had built up a tolerance to many toxins and simply vomited it up. So they sent Narcissus, a professional athlete, to finish the job in the emperor's bath, where he was strangled while trying to sober up from the failed poisoning. Caracalla, another emperor, met his end while relieving himself during a journey to a temple. The Praetorian prefect Macrinus had grown tired of Caracalla's expensive wars and impossible demands, so he arranged for a soldier named Martialis to stab the emperor while he was urinating by the roadside. Even emperors have to answer nature's call, and apparently that's when they're most vulnerable to ambitious subordinates with sharp objects. The afternoon execution became so common that some emperors developed paranoia that would make modern conspiracy theorists look reasonable. Domitian had the walls of his bedroom covered in reflective stone so he could see anyone approaching from any angle. He executed people for the smallest infractions and trusted no one, which ironically made people want to kill him even more. His assassination was planned for months, with conspirators including his wife Domitian, his chamberlain Parthenius, and even his personal secretary Epaphroditus. They told him there was a fire in the city to get him away from his guards, then stabbed him in his private quarters. The emperor who feared death by treachery died exactly as he feared, surrounded by people he thought he could trust. Nero, the emperor who allegedly fiddled while Rome burned, actually tried to flee when he realized the Praetorian Guard and Senate had turned against him. He spent his last day hiding in a villa outside Rome, composing bad poetry about his own death and practicing suicide. When he heard horses approaching, he finally drove a dagger into his throat, but not before crying, "What an artist dies in me," which has to be one of the most narcissistic last words in history. But even when emperors saw the danger coming, they couldn't escape it. Galba, an emperor who lasted only 7 months, was warned by fortune-tellers and omens that his death was imminent. He ignored the warnings and was hacked to pieces in the Roman Forum by a mob of Praetorian guards and citizens who were angry about unpaid bonuses and higher taxes. His head was carried around on a spear while his body was left for dogs, which was the ancient Roman equivalent of going viral for all the wrong reasons. The strange thing about these imperial murders is how casually they were accepted by Roman society. Assassination wasn't seen as a crime against the state, it was seen as a form of political correction. When an emperor went too far, became too cruel, or simply outlived his usefulness, someone would arrange his death and life would go on. The Senate would meet, declare the old emperor a tyrant posthumously, and welcome the new one with speeches about restored liberty and justice. It was political theater with real blood. Septimius Severus lasted 18 years, partly because he understood the game better than most. His advice to his sons was simple: enrich the soldiers, ignore everyone else. He knew that as long as the Praetorian Guard was well paid and happy, they'd protect him from other threats. But his son Caracalla followed that advice too literally, giving massive bonuses to soldiers while bankrupting the empire and terrorizing the civilian population. His own Praetorian prefect Macrinus finally had him killed, not out of moral outrage, but because the empire couldn't afford Caracalla's spending habits anymore. It was economics, not ethics, that sealed his fate. Some emperors tried to protect themselves through sheer brutality. Caligula executed people for sneezing in his presence or failing to laugh at his jokes. He declared himself a god and demanded that people worship him while he was still alive. But paranoia and cruelty just made more enemies. His assassination was carried out by the same Praetorian guards who were supposed to die for him, led by Cassius Chaerea, whom Caligula had repeatedly humiliated with sexual jokes and feminine passwords. Chaerea stabbed the emperor in an underground passage after a theater performance, then made sure to kill Caligula's wife and infant daughter to prevent any revenge. The most pathetic imperial murder might be that of Vitellius, who lasted only 8 months during the chaotic year of 4 emperors in 69 CE. Vitellius was infamous for his gluttony, reportedly eating 4 massive meals a day and vomiting between courses so he could eat more. When rival armies approached Rome, he tried to abdicate but was told it was too late. He spent his last day wandering the empty palace, eating food from the kitchens and wondering where everyone had gone. When enemy soldiers found him hiding, he was dragged through the streets, beaten, tortured, and finally stabbed to death near the Tiber River. His body was thrown into the river with hooks, which was reserved for the worst criminals. Even his enemies thought he was pathetic rather than evil. The lunch hour assassinations weren't just about timing, they were about psychology. Killing an emperor during his meal or afternoon rest sent a message that no one was safe, no matter how powerful. Romans understood that power was temporary, that today's god emperor was tomorrow's corpse, and that the only constant in politics was change through violence. The Praetorian Guard institutionalized this cycle. They became kingmakers who could elevate or eliminate emperors based on their own interests. When Pertinax tried to discipline them and cut their bonuses, they murdered him after only 87 days in power. Then they literally auctioned off the imperial throne to the highest bidder, which was won by Didius Julianus, who lasted 66 days before he too was killed for failing to pay what he'd promised. It was like eBay for empires, except the merchandise kept getting murdered. The afternoon became the empire's killing hour because it represented the intersection of opportunity and vulnerability. Emperors had to eat, they had to relax, they had to trust someone, and those moments of humanity made them mortal. Assassins learned to exploit routine, to turn daily necessities into deadly opportunities. A simple lunch invitation could be a death warrant, an afternoon meeting could be an execution, and a friendly conversation could end with a dagger between the ribs. Augustus, the first emperor, lived to 75 and died peacefully in bed, but he was the exception, not the rule. He understood that survival required constant vigilance, careful management of the Praetorian Guard, and the wisdom to know when to be generous and when to be ruthless. His successors learned these lessons imperfectly or not at all, and paid for their ignorance with their lives. The Roman Empire's body count of dead emperors reads like a medieval horror story. Tiberius, possibly smothered with a pillow. Caligula, stabbed repeatedly. Claudius, poisoned. Nero, forced to suicide. Galba, hacked apart. Otho, suicide. Vitellius, beaten to death. Domitian, stabbed. Commodus, strangled. Pertinax, murdered by guards. Caracalla, stabbed while urinating. Elagabalus, killed by Praetorians. Severus Alexander, murdered by mutinous soldiers. The list goes on, like an ancient Game of Thrones where everyone important dies violently and usually before dessert. The lunch hour murders became so common that later emperors tried to change their routines, eating at random times, using food tasters, and varying their schedules. But paranoia couldn't save them because the real threat wasn't the food or the timing, it was the system itself. Rome had created a form of government where ultimate power was held by one man, but that man was surrounded by ambitious subordinates with armies, private interests, and flexible loyalties. It was a political structure designed to produce violence. The Praetorian Guard, who were created to protect the emperor, became his greatest threat because they had the access, the weapons, and the organization to kill him. They also had the power to choose his replacement, which gave them enormous leverage in imperial politics. When an emperor disappointed them or threatened their privileges, they simply removed him and installed someone more cooperative. It was the ancient version of a corporate board firing a CEO, except with more stabbing and less severance pay. By the 3rd century, the imperial murder rate had accelerated to such a degree that the period is known as the crisis of the 3rd century. In 50 years, the empire had over 20 emperors, most of whom died violently. Some lasted only weeks or months before being killed by rivals, subordinates, or their own troops. The empire nearly collapsed under the weight of constant civil war, barbarian invasions, economic collapse, and the endless cycle of assassination and revenge. It took Diocletian's radical reforms, including splitting the empire and reducing the power of the Praetorian Guard, to finally break the pattern. But let's go deeper into the psychology of these murders, because understanding why so many emperors died tells us something profound about power itself. Take Caligula, for instance. His real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but everyone called him Caligula, which means little boots, because as a child he wore miniature soldiers' boots around the military camps where his father Germanicus was stationed. He started his reign popular and generous, releasing political prisoners, giving bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, and putting on spectacular games. But something went wrong. Maybe it was the absolute power, maybe it was a mental illness, or maybe it was the realization that he could do literally anything to anyone without consequences. Within a year, Caligula was declaring himself a living god, having conversations with statues of Jupiter, and ordering his soldiers to collect seashells as spoils of war against Neptune. He made his horse Incitatus a consul, built a temporary bridge across the Bay of Naples just so he could ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate, and forced senators to run beside his chariot in their togas. But the real breaking point came when he started having people executed for entertainment. He'd order deaths during dinner parties, watch people being tortured while he ate, and once famously said he wished the Roman people had only one neck so he could cut it with a single blow. The Praetorian Guards who were supposed to protect him began to see him not as an emperor but as a rabid animal that needed to be put down. The conspiracy against Caligula was led by Cassius Chaerea, a Praetorian tribune who had served under Caligula's father and grandfather with distinction. But Caligula delighted in humiliating him, giving him passwords like Venus and Cupid, and making sexual jokes about his voice and mannerisms in front of other soldiers. Chaerea endured this for months, but when Caligula announced plans to move the capital to Alexandria and leave Rome permanently, the Praetorians realized they would lose their privileged position. The murder itself was almost anticlimactic. During a theater performance, Chaerea and his conspirators cornered Caligula in an underground corridor. The emperor, perhaps realizing what was happening, reportedly said, "I am still alive," to which Chaerea replied, "Strike again," to his fellow conspirators. They stabbed him over 30 times, then went to the palace and killed his wife Causonia and their infant daughter Julia Drusilla by smashing the baby's head against a wall. It was thorough, brutal, and efficient. The interesting thing about Caligula's murder is how quickly it was forgotten. Within hours, the Praetorian Guard had found his uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace and declared him emperor. The Senate briefly debated restoring the Republic, but the guards made it clear that they preferred emperors who paid bonuses. Claudius, who had a stutter and a limp and had been considered harmless his whole life, suddenly found himself ruler of the known world because his nephew had been too crazy to live. Claudius turned out to be a surprisingly effective emperor, conquering Britain, building aqueducts, and generally governing competently for 13 years. But he made one fatal mistake. He married Agrippina the Younger, Caligula's sister and one of the most ruthlessly ambitious women in Roman history. Agrippina had a son from a previous marriage named Nero, and she was determined to make him emperor. The problem was that Claudius also had a son, Britannicus, from his previous wife Messalina, whom he had executed for treason. As Claudius aged, he began to favor Britannicus over Nero, which meant Agrippina's ambitions were threatened. The solution was simple: kill Claudius before he could change his succession plans. Agrippina employed a professional poisoner named Locusta, who had a reputation for discretion and effectiveness. The poison of choice was reportedly derived from mushrooms, which were Claudius's favorite food. Some accounts say it was administered in a dish of mushrooms, others that it was painted on a feather that was used to tickle his throat and induce vomiting, which was a common practice after large meals. The poison worked slowly, giving Claudius time to realize he was dying and allegedly to mutter, "I think I've been poisoned," but not enough time to name Britannicus as his heir or expose the conspiracy. Nero became emperor at age 16, with his mother Agrippina effectively ruling as regent. But the mother-son relationship soon soured as Nero chafed under her control and began to assert his independence. Agrippina had created a monster, and like Dr. Frankenstein, she would soon discover that her creation had a mind of its own. Nero's early years as emperor were actually quite promising. He was advised by the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, both competent men who tried to guide him toward reasonable policies. But as Nero matured, his personality darkened. He became obsessed with performing as an actor and chariot racer, which Romans considered beneath the dignity of an emperor. He married and divorced multiple wives, had affairs with both men and women, and gradually surrounded himself with flatterers and enablers who encouraged his worst impulses. The break with his mother came when Agrippina tried to assert control over his choice of wives and advisors. Nero's response was to try to kill her, first with a collapsing boat that was designed to sink and drown her, then with a collapsing bedroom ceiling, and finally by simply having her stabbed to death by a freedman named Anicetus. When Agrippina's body was brought to him, Nero reportedly examined it and commented on her physical features, showing no remorse for matricide. The murder of his mother marked Nero's transformation from a potentially salvageable young ruler to a full-blown tyrant. He began executing senators on flimsy pretexts, confiscating property to fund his extravagant building projects and entertainment spectacles, and generally behaving like Caligula with better advisors. When the Great Fire of Rome broke out in 64 CE, rumors spread that Nero had started it to clear land for his new palace, the Domus Aurea or Golden House. Whether or not he actually caused the fire, his response to it was tone-deaf. Instead of focusing on relief efforts, he used the crisis as an opportunity to build an enormous palace complex that covered nearly a third of the city, complete with artificial lakes, gardens, and a 120-foot-tall bronze statue of himself. The final straw came in 68 CE, when Nero's fiscal policies and arbitrary executions triggered revolts in Gaul, Spain, and Africa. The Roman legions declared for the rebel governor Galba, and the Praetorian Guard, seeing which way the wind was blowing, abandoned Nero. When he realized that his situation was hopeless, Nero fled Rome with a few loyal freedmen and hid in a villa outside the city. As search parties closed in, he finally worked up the courage to commit suicide, reportedly saying, "What an artist dies in me," as he drove a dagger into his throat. His death ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty and triggered the Year of Four Emperors, a chaotic period that saw 4 different men claim the imperial throne in rapid succession. Galba, the stern old general who had led the revolt against Nero, lasted 7 months before being murdered by supporters of Otho. Otho ruled for 3 months before committing suicide when his forces were defeated by those of Vitellius. Vitellius managed 8 months before being killed by supporters of Vespasian. Each of these transitions involved the Praetorian Guard switching sides, usually in exchange for promises of increased pay and bonuses. The Year of Four Emperors demonstrated how unstable the imperial system really was when the army lost confidence in the ruler. It also showed how the Praetorian Guard had evolved from protectors of the emperor to kingmakers who could make or break dynasties based on their own interests. Vespasian, who finally restored stability, was a practical soldier who understood that the key to survival was keeping the army happy and the treasury full. He famously said, "Money has no odor," when criticized for taxing public urinals, and his reign marked the beginning of the Flavian dynasty. But even Vespasian's family couldn't escape the curse of imperial murder. His younger son Domitian, who became emperor after his brother Titus died in 81 CE, started his reign competently but gradually descended into paranoia and tyranny. Domitian was actually an effective administrator and military commander, expanding the empire's borders and improving its infrastructure. But he was also deeply insecure about his legitimacy, having come to power only because his older brother died unexpectedly. This insecurity manifested as increasing authoritarianism and a growing tendency to see conspiracies everywhere. Domitian revived the treason trials that had made Tiberius's later years so terrifying, executing senators for allegedly plotting against him or simply for being too wealthy or popular. He insisted on being addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and erected statues of himself throughout the empire. He also became obsessed with the idea that his wife Domitia was plotting against him, which ironically may have driven her to actually join a conspiracy against him. The plot that finally brought down Domitian was organized by a group of palace insiders who had grown tired of living in fear. The conspirators included his wife Domitia, his chamberlain Parthenius, his personal secretary Epaphroditus, and the Praetorian prefects Petronius Secundus and Norbanus. They chose September 18, 96 CE, for the assassination, telling Domitian that there was a fire in the city to get him away from his bodyguards. When he went to investigate, he was cornered in his bedroom and stabbed to death by a freedman named Stephanus, who had hidden a dagger in a bandage on his arm. The murder was so thoroughly planned that the conspirators had already chosen Domitian's successor, Nerva, an elderly senator who they knew would be grateful for their support and unlikely to live long enough to turn against them. Nerva's reign marked the beginning of the Antonine dynasty and what historians call the Five Good Emperors, a period of relative stability that lasted nearly a century. But even during this golden age, the threat of assassination never disappeared entirely. Nerva himself was pressured by the Praetorian Guard to execute Domitian's assassins, showing that even good emperors had to navigate the dangerous politics of the Guard's loyalty. The Antonine emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, generally avoided the fate of their predecessors by being competent rulers who kept the army happy and the economy stable. But their success also demonstrated how much the survival of individual emperors depended on their personal qualities and circumstances rather than any inherent stability in the imperial system. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, his son Commodus inherited the throne and almost immediately began undoing his father's work. Commodus represents perhaps the most dramatic example of how absolute power could corrupt even someone raised with the best possible education and moral guidance. Marcus Aurelius had been a philosopher-emperor who wrote the Meditations, one of the great works of Stoic philosophy, and had tried to instill in his son the virtues of duty, self-discipline, and service to the state. But Commodus was more interested in gladiatorial games, wild parties, and living out his fantasy of being the reincarnation of Hercules. Commodus's reign began relatively normally, but within a few years he was spending most of his time in the amphitheater, fighting as a gladiator against opponents who were ordered to let him win. He renamed the months of the year after his various titles, called Rome Commodiana, and generally behaved like a character from a bad movie about decadent emperors. The Senate and Praetorian Guard tolerated this for 12 years, partly because Commodus delegated most actual governing to competent administrators and partly because he was generous with bonuses and entertainment. But by 192 CE, his behavior had become so erratic and his paranoia so severe that even his closest associates feared for their lives. The conspiracy against Commodus involved his mistress Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect Laetus. They initially tried to poison him during a New Year's Eve party, slipping the poison into his wine. But Commodus had built up a tolerance to many toxins through his hypochondriacal use of antidotes, and he simply vomited up the poison and went to his bath to sober up. This created a problem for the conspirators, because a failed poisoning attempt would certainly be investigated, and they would all be executed if discovered. So they sent Narcissus, a young athlete who served as Commodus's wrestling partner, to strangle him in the bath. The murder itself was almost absurdly undignified. Here was the Emperor of Rome, the man who claimed to be the reincarnation of Hercules, being strangled naked in his bathtub by his exercise instructor. Commodus's death marked the end of the Antonine dynasty and triggered another civil war, as multiple claimants fought for the throne. The winner was Septimius Severus, a North African general who understood better than most that imperial power rested on military support. His advice to his sons was brutally simple: enrich the soldiers, ignore everyone else. This strategy worked for Severus himself, who ruled for 18 years and died of natural causes while campaigning in Britain. But his son Caracalla took the advice too literally, bankrupting the empire with military bonuses while terrorizing the civilian population with arbitrary executions and confiscations. Caracalla's reign was marked by extreme paranoia and violence. He murdered his younger brother Geta in their mother's arms, then had thousands of Geta's supporters executed. He raised soldiers' pay by 50% while debasing the currency, causing inflation that devastated the economy. He built enormous public baths in Rome but paid for them by confiscating the property of wealthy citizens on trumped-up charges. The man who finally killed Caracalla was his own praetorian prefect, Macrinus, who had grown tired of the emperor's impossible demands and erratic behavior. Macrinus arranged for a soldier named Martialis to assassinate Caracalla while the emperor was relieving himself during a journey to visit a temple near Carrhae. The murder was almost comically undignified: the Emperor of Rome, stabbed to death while urinating by the side of a road. Martialis was immediately killed by Caracalla's bodyguards, but Macrinus had his revenge and soon made himself emperor. The pattern of lunch hour and afternoon assassinations continued throughout the 3rd century, a period so chaotic that historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century. In the 50 years from 235 to 284 CE, the empire had over 20 emperors, most of whom died violently. Some, like Maximinus Thrax, were killed by their own soldiers. Others, like Valerian, were captured by enemies and died in captivity. Still others, like Gallienus, were assassinated by their own officers during military campaigns. The reasons for this instability were complex: barbarian invasions, economic collapse, plague, and the breakdown of the traditional Roman class system all played a role. But the immediate cause of most imperial deaths was the same as it had been for centuries: ambitious subordinates who decided that the current emperor was a liability and needed to be replaced. The hour remained the preferred time for these murders because it remained the time when emperors were most vulnerable. Even in the chaotic 3rd century, rulers still had to eat, still had to conduct business, and still had to trust their closest associates. And those associates, whether they were praetorian prefects, military commanders, or palace officials, had both the access and the motivation to kill their nominal superiors when circumstances demanded it. One of the most dramatic examples of this pattern was the murder of Aurelian in 275 CE. Aurelian was actually one of the more successful 3rd century emperors, earning the nickname Restorer of the World for his military victories and administrative reforms. He had defeated the breakaway Gallic Empire, reconquered Egypt from the Pommerane Empire, and built new walls around Rome to protect it from barbarian attacks. But Aurelian was also known for his harsh discipline and violent temper, qualities that made him many enemies among his own officers. The conspiracy against Aurelian was triggered by a forged letter that convinced his secretary Eros that the emperor was planning to execute him and several other officials. Rather than wait to be killed, Eros organized a preemptive strike, convincing a group of military officers that they were all on Aurelian's death list. The murder took place while Aurelian was traveling between Constantinople and Rome, during a stop for the midday meal. The conspirators surrounded the emperor's tent and stabbed him to death, then tried to present his death as the result of a barbarian attack. The deception didn't work for long, and when the truth came out, the army was so angry that they hunted down and executed all the conspirators. But the damage was done, another competent emperor was dead, and the empire was once again thrown into chaos. The crisis of the 3rd century finally ended with the accession of Diocletian in 284 CE. Diocletian was a shrewd administrator who realized that the empire had grown too large and complex to be ruled by a single emperor from Rome. His solution was radical. He split the empire into eastern and western halves, each ruled by an Augustus with a junior Caesar as heir apparent. This system, called the Tetrarchy, was designed to prevent the kind of succession crises that had plagued the empire for decades. Diocletian also moved the imperial court away from Rome, establishing new capitals at Nicomedia and other cities where the emperors could be closer to the frontiers and less influenced by the traditional Roman aristocracy. Most importantly for our story, Diocletian disbanded the Praetorian Guard and replaced them with new units that were more closely supervised and less politically powerful. These reforms worked, at least temporarily. The Tetrarchy brought stability to the empire and ended the cycle of military coups and assassinations that had characterized the 3rd century. But the system was inherently unstable, depending as it did on the cooperation of 4 different rulers with potentially conflicting interests. When Diocletian retired in 305 CE, the first Roman emperor ever to voluntarily give up power, the Tetrarchy quickly broke down into civil war as the various Caesars and Augusti fought for supreme control. The winner of this conflict was Constantine, who reunited the empire under his sole rule and established a new capital at Constantinople. Constantine's reign marked the beginning of a new era in which the emperor was no longer just a military commander and civil administrator but also the head of the Christian Church. This religious dimension added a new layer of complexity to imperial politics, as emperors now had to navigate not only secular opposition but also religious controversies and church politics. But even the Christianization of the empire didn't end the tradition of imperial assassination. Constantine's sons fought a civil war after his death, and several later emperors met violent ends. Julian the Apostate was killed in battle against the Persians in 363 CE, possibly by a Christian soldier in his own army who objected to his attempts to restore paganism. Valens was killed at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE when his army was destroyed by Gothic invaders. The Western Empire continued to suffer from the same problems that had plagued the Principate: weak emperors, ambitious generals, barbarian invasions, and economic decline. The last Western emperors were largely puppets of barbarian federati or Germanic generals who held the real power behind the scenes. When these puppet emperors outlived their usefulness, they were simply murdered and replaced, just as their predecessors had been centuries earlier. Honorius, who ruled the Western Empire from 393 to 423 CE, survived only because he was useful to his Germanic general Stilicho and later because he was weak enough to be controlled by other ambitious subordinates. His successor Valentinian III was murdered in 455 CE by supporters of the general Aetius, whom Valentinian had previously killed with his own hands during a palace meeting. The last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 CE by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, who decided that having a puppet emperor was more trouble than it was worth and simply sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. The Eastern Empire, which became the Byzantine Empire, lasted another 1,000 years, but it too was plagued by palace coups, assassinations, and civil wars. The difference was that the Byzantines developed more sophisticated methods of political murder, including blinding, which disqualified a person from rule under Roman law, castration, and exile to monasteries. But the basic pattern remained the same: ambitious subordinates killed weak or unpopular emperors and replaced them with more amenable candidates. The lunch hour assassination remained a constant throughout Byzantine history. The Emperor Maurice was killed in 602 CE while trying to flee a military revolt, along with his 6 sons. Phocas, who replaced him, was tortured to death in 610 CE by supporters of Heraclius. Michael III was murdered in 867 CE by his co-emperor Basil, who invited him to dinner and then had him stabbed to death. Nicephorus II Phocas was killed in his bedroom in 969 CE by a conspiracy involving his wife and her lover, the future John I Simoiscus. The pattern continued right up to the fall of Constantinople in 1453 CE, when Constantine XI Palaiologos died fighting on the city walls as Turkish soldiers poured through the breaches. In many ways, the Roman Empire never solved the fundamental problem of succession that had plagued it from the beginning. Because the emperor held absolute power but that power was not truly hereditary or constitutional, every transition was potentially a crisis that could trigger civil war, military revolt, or palace conspiracy. The emperors who survived were those who managed to balance the competing interests of the army, the aristocracy, the bureaucracy, and the people while avoiding the personal behaviors that made them targets for assassination. But this balancing act was so difficult and the stakes so high that most emperors eventually made a fatal mistake. The lunch hour murders were not aberrations or accidents but inevitable consequences of a political system that concentrated enormous power in the hands of individuals while providing no legitimate mechanism for removing them when they became incompetent, corrupt, or simply unlucky. The meals that became death scenes, the afternoon meetings that turned into executions, the casual conversations that ended with daggers, these were the predictable results of a system that governed through fear rather than consent and that defined political opposition as treason punishable by death. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Roman imperial assassination tradition is how routine it became. By the 2nd century CE, senators would openly discuss which emperor might be killed next and who would make a suitable replacement. Palace servants learned to read the signs of an impending coup, unusual meetings between praetorian officers, sudden changes in guard rotations, or the emperor's food taster calling in sick. The imperial household developed its own vocabulary of euphemisms for murder. An emperor who was called to the gods had been poisoned, one who joined his ancestors in sleep had been smothered, and one who fell on his sword for Rome had been forced to commit suicide. Even the emperors themselves became grimly fatalistic about their likely fate. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations that a ruler must be prepared to die at any moment, not just from disease or accident but from the knives of those closest to him. Septimius Severus reportedly told his sons that they should assume everyone around them was a potential assassin and plan accordingly. Diocletian's decision to retire voluntarily was partly motivated by his observation that no emperor who died in bed had enjoyed his final years, while those who were murdered often seemed surprised by their fate right up until the moment the blade went in. The psychological toll of living under constant threat of assassination shaped the personalities of later emperors in predictable ways. Some, like Domitian, became paranoid recluses who trusted no one and saw conspiracies everywhere. Others, like Caligula and Commodus, seemed to embrace the danger, behaving recklessly as if daring their enemies to try to kill them. Still others, like Claudius before his marriage to Agrippina, tried to make themselves seem harmless and incompetent, hoping that their perceived weakness would make them less threatening to potential rivals. But perhaps the most disturbing response was that of emperors who preemptively murdered anyone who might conceivably pose a threat. Caracalla's massacre of his brother's supporters, Domitian's revival of treason trials, and the countless executions ordered by paranoid rulers were all attempts to prevent assassination by killing potential assassins first. This strategy never worked for long, because it inevitably created new enemies among the friends and families of the victims, leading to an escalating cycle of violence that usually ended with the emperor's own death. The Romans themselves recognized the self-defeating nature of this cycle, but they seemed unable to break it. Tacitus wrote that tyranny corrupts both the ruler and the ruled, creating a climate of fear and suspicion that makes violence inevitable. Suetonius documented the increasingly bizarre behaviors of emperors who knew they were likely to be murdered, showing how the expectation of assassination became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Even Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, acknowledged that the imperial system was fundamentally flawed, though he felt duty-bound to serve within it rather than try to reform it. The lunch hour murders were particularly effective because they exploited the basic human need for routine and normalcy. Even the most paranoid emperor had to eat, had to conduct business, had to maintain relationships with other people. The men who killed Julius Caesar understood this when they chose the Senate meeting on the Ides of March, a routine political gathering where Caesar would be relaxed and surrounded by familiar faces. The conspirators against Domitian knew that he would investigate reports of a fire in the city, because a responsible emperor couldn't ignore such news even if he suspected a trap. The assassins of Commodus realized that he was most vulnerable in his bath, where he was naked, alone, and focused on recovering from his failed poisoning. Each of these murders succeeded because the killers understood that their targets were human beings with human vulnerabilities, not gods or monsters immune to ordinary dangers. The timing of these assassinations also reveals something important about Roman attitudes toward power and mortality. The midday meal was traditionally a time of relaxation and reflection, when Romans paused their daily activities to nourish their bodies and enjoy the company of friends and family. By choosing this moment for murder, assassins were making a statement about the relationship between power and mortality. They were saying that no one, no matter how powerful, could escape the basic requirements of human existence, and that those requirements created opportunities for those who were patient and clever enough to exploit them. The afternoon murders served a similar symbolic function. In Roman culture, the afternoon was associated with leisure, contemplation, and the pursuit of personal pleasures. It was when wealthy Romans visited their gardens, read philosophy, or engaged in intellectual discussions with their peers. By killing emperors during these peaceful moments, assassins were demonstrating that absolute power was incompatible with peace of mind, that a ruler who claimed divine authority was still subject to human frailty, and that the political never truly became personal. The weapons used in these assassinations were also symbolically significant. Daggers and short swords were personal weapons that required close contact between killer and victim. Unlike arrows or poison, which could be delivered from a distance, blade weapons forced the assassin to look his target in the eye and physically overpower him. This intimacy was deliberate, because it emphasized that the emperor was being killed not by some abstract force or distant enemy but by someone who had been close enough to touch him, someone who had shared his meals and listened to his conversations and earned his trust. The treachery was the point. Many of the most famous imperial assassinations involved multiple wounds inflicted by multiple attackers, a pattern that served both practical and symbolic purposes. Practically, having several conspirators ensured that the job would be finished even if one attacker hesitated or missed his target. Symbolically, the multiple wounds represented the collective judgment of the emperor's inner circle, showing that his death was not the result of a single person's grievance but of widespread dissatisfaction with his rule. When Caesar was stabbed 23 times, when Caligula received over 30 wounds, when Domitian was attacked by multiple conspirators, the message was clear: this was not personal revenge but political execution. The locations chosen for these murders were equally meaningful. Bedrooms, dining rooms, baths, and private gardens were all spaces associated with vulnerability and intimacy. By killing emperors in these settings, assassins were violating the most basic assumptions about safety and trust. They were saying that absolute power made true privacy impossible, that a ruler could never truly relax, and that the imperial palace was not a home but a trap. This psychological warfare was often as important as the physical act of murder, because it served to intimidate future emperors and remind them that their power depended on the continued tolerance of their subordinates. The immediate aftermath of these assassinations followed predictable patterns that reveal how institutionalized political murder had become in the Roman system. First, there was usually a brief period of confusion as news of the emperor's death spread through the palace and the city. During this window, the conspirators had to move quickly to secure the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard and announce their choice of successor. Speed was essential, because rival claimants might emerge if the transition dragged on too long. Next came the official announcement, which always followed the same script: the dead emperor was either declared a tyrant who had deserved his fate or described as a victim of tragic circumstances beyond anyone's control. If the conspirators wanted to distance themselves from the murder, they would blame foreign enemies, common criminals, or mysterious natural causes. If they wanted to take credit for saving Rome from tyranny, they would emphasize the dead emperor's crimes and present themselves as liberators acting in the public interest. The new emperor would then give speeches about restoration, reform, and return to traditional Roman values, regardless of whether he intended to change anything substantial about imperial policy. The third phase involved the systematic elimination of potential threats to the new regime. This usually meant executing or exiling the dead emperor's closest supporters, confiscating their property, and redistributing it to buy the loyalty of key military and political figures. Sometimes the new emperor would also order the murder of the dead emperor's family members, especially any sons who might grow up to seek revenge. These purges were presented as necessary security measures, but they actually served to demonstrate the new emperor's ruthlessness and willingness to use violence to maintain power. Finally, there was the historical revision, in which court historians and poets were commissioned to write accounts that justified the new emperor's rise to power and explained why his predecessor's death had been inevitable. These official histories became the basis for later accounts, which is why so many imperial assassinations are remembered as the result of the victim's moral failings rather than his political mistakes. The emperors who were murdered were retroactively transformed into cautionary tales about the dangers of tyranny, excess, or weakness, while their killers were portrayed as reluctant heroes who had acted only when all other options were exhausted. This cycle of murder, succession, and historical revision became so routine that many Romans began to see it as a natural part of their political system. Ambitious young men calculated their chances of surviving long enough to become emperor, while older senators made wagers on which ruler would be killed next and how long his successor might last. The imperial court developed elaborate protocols for managing the transition from one emperor to the next, including predetermined lists of officials who would be executed, exiled, or promoted when the inevitable change occurred. Even the emperors themselves participated in this morbid planning, sometimes choosing their own successors or arranging for the elimination of potential rivals before their own deaths. The lunch hour murders became so common that they influenced Roman architecture and interior design. Later imperial palaces were built with multiple escape routes, hidden passages, and reinforced dining rooms that could be sealed off in case of attack. Food service became increasingly elaborate, with multiple courses served by different sets of servants to make poisoning more difficult. The emperor's bed was often placed in the center of a large room with clear sight lines to all entrances, and trusted guards were stationed in adjoining chambers to respond quickly to any disturbance. These defensive measures sometimes worked, but they also created an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that made normal social relationships impossible. The most successful emperors learned to navigate this dangerous environment by developing a kind of political sixth sense that allowed them to detect threats before they materialized. They studied the body language of their courtiers, monitored conversations among their guards, and paid attention to subtle changes in routine that might signal an impending coup. Some, like Augustus and Trajan, became masters of this deadly game, using a combination of generosity, intimidation, and careful personnel management to neutralize potential assassins before they could act. Others, like Claudius and Marcus Aurelius, survived partly through luck and partly by delegating enough authority to trusted subordinates that no single conspiracy could control the entire government. But even the most skillful emperors lived with the constant awareness that their survival depended on factors beyond their control. A crop failure that made grain expensive, a military defeat that damaged their prestige, a plague that disrupted the economy, or simply a change in fashion that made their style of leadership seem outdated could trigger the kind of discontent that led to assassination plots. The imperial system created a kind of political Darwinism in which only the most adaptable and ruthless individuals could survive, and even they could be eliminated by bad luck or a single moment of inattention. The psychological impact of this system extended far beyond the emperors themselves. Senators learned to be careful about their words and associations, knowing that today's ally might be tomorrow's enemy and that being too closely identified with any particular emperor could be fatal when the inevitable transition occurred. Military commanders had to balance their loyalty to the current emperor against their need to maintain credibility with their troops, who might defect to a rival claimant at any moment. Palace servants developed elaborate codes of conduct that allowed them to serve their masters faithfully while avoiding the appearance of excessive loyalty that might make them targets for the next regime. The Roman people, meanwhile, became accustomed to sudden changes in leadership and learned not to invest too much emotional energy in any particular emperor. Public celebrations of imperial victories were muted by the knowledge that the celebrating emperor might be dead within months. Monuments to imperial achievements were built with removable inscriptions so that they could be quickly rededicated when regimes changed. Even religious ceremonies honoring the emperor were conducted with a kind of detached professionalism that acknowledged the temporary nature of imperial divinity. This institutionalization of political murder had profound effects on Roman culture and society. Literature and art became obsessed with themes of betrayal, revenge, and the transience of power. Philosophers developed elaborate theories about the relationship between virtue and survival, often concluding that a truly good person could not maintain power for long in such a corrupt system. Historians focused on the moral lessons to be drawn from imperial assassinations, using them as evidence for their arguments about the dangers of absolute power or the inevitability of divine justice. The lunch hour murders also influenced Roman religious practices and beliefs. Many Romans began to see the frequent assassination of emperors as evidence that the gods disapproved of the imperial system or that divine justice was punishing rulers for their crimes. Others interpreted the murders as proof that fortune was fickle and that human plans were subject to forces beyond rational understanding. Still others developed fatalistic philosophies that emphasized acceptance of death and the futility of trying to control one's destiny. These religious and philosophical responses to imperial violence became important components of later Roman culture, influencing everything from Stoic philosophy to early Christian theology. The economic consequences of the lunch hour murder tradition were equally significant. The constant threat of political instability made long-term economic planning nearly impossible, as investors and merchants could never be sure that current policies would survive the next imperial transition. Trade routes that depended on imperial protection could be disrupted overnight if a new emperor decided to pursue different military priorities. Currency values fluctuated wildly as markets tried to anticipate the fiscal policies of future rulers. The cost of maintaining the Praetorian Guard and other security forces necessary to protect emperors consumed an ever-increasing share of the imperial budget, leaving less money available for infrastructure, military expansion, or social programs. Perhaps most importantly, the energy and attention that emperors devoted to simply staying alive was energy that they could not spend on governing effectively. Many potentially capable rulers became so obsessed with identifying and eliminating threats to their survival that they neglected the basic functions of administration, military command, and economic management. This created a vicious cycle in which poor governance led to increased discontent, which led to more assassination plots, which led to more paranoia and defensive measures, which led to even worse governance. The cycle was broken only temporarily by exceptional individuals like Augustus, Trajan, or Marcus Aurelius, who managed to govern effectively despite the constant threat to their lives. The international implications of Rome's assassination culture were also profound. Foreign rulers and ambassadors learned that Roman policy could change dramatically overnight, making diplomatic agreements and military alliances inherently unstable. Enemy kingdoms sometimes timed their attacks to coincide with imperial transitions, knowing that a new emperor would need time to consolidate his position before responding to external threats. Some foreign powers even tried to influence Roman succession disputes by supporting particular claimants or assassinating emperors whose policies they opposed. The reputation of Roman political instability became a diplomatic liability that undermined the empire's credibility and encouraged its enemies to test its resolve. As the empire evolved and faced new challenges, the pattern of lunch hour murders adapted but never disappeared. During the crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire was threatened by simultaneous barbarian invasions, economic collapse, and plague, the assassination rate actually increased as desperate military commanders eliminated weak or incompetent emperors and replaced them with leaders they hoped would be more effective. The murders became more brutal and public, as assassins sought to demonstrate their strength and determination to both supporters and enemies. Some emperors were killed in front of their own troops, their deaths serving as object lessons about the consequences of military failure or political miscalculation. The rise of Christianity added new dimensions to imperial assassination without fundamentally changing the practice. Christian emperors were just as likely to be murdered as their pagan predecessors, though the justifications offered for their deaths often included religious as well as political arguments. The Emperor Julian was possibly killed by a Christian soldier who objected to his attempts to restore paganism, while other Christian emperors were murdered by rivals who claimed divine sanction for their actions. The Church itself became a new source of potential assassins, as bishops and monks sometimes concluded that killing a heretical or immoral emperor was a religious duty. Even when the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed in 476 CE, the tradition of imperial assassination continued in the Byzantine Empire for another 1,000 years. Byzantine emperors developed more sophisticated security measures and more elaborate succession procedures, but they still died violent deaths with remarkable frequency. The methods evolved, blinding and castration became common alternatives to simple murder, but the basic pattern remained the same. Ambitious subordinates eliminated weak or unpopular rulers and replaced them with more amenable candidates, often timing their moves to coincide with moments of maximum vulnerability. The lunch hour murder tradition even influenced the barbarian kingdoms that replaced Roman authority in Western Europe. Germanic kings and Frankish rulers adopted many Roman court customs, including the practice of eliminating rivals through assassination. The Merovingian kings of France were particularly notorious for murdering their own family members, while Anglo-Saxon rulers in Britain often died violent deaths at the hands of their own retainers. The political culture of assassination that Rome had perfected spread throughout post-Roman Europe, contributing to the political instability that characterized the early medieval period. Looking back at this long history of imperial murder, several patterns emerge that help explain why the lunch hour assassination became such a persistent feature of Roman political life. First, the concentration of absolute power in the hands of a single individual created irresistible temptations for ambitious subordinates who believed they could do better. Second, the lack of any legitimate mechanism for removing incompetent or corrupt emperors meant that assassination became the default method of political change. Third, the success of early assassinations created precedents and expectations that made future murders seem normal and acceptable. Fourth, the institutional interests of groups like the Praetorian Guard gave them both the motive and the opportunity to eliminate emperors who threatened their privileges or failed to meet their expectations. The timing of these murders during meals and afternoon activities was not accidental but reflected a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and vulnerability. The assassins who killed Julius Caesar, Caligula, Domitian, and dozens of other emperors understood that their targets were most vulnerable when they were engaged in routine activities that required them to lower their guard and trust other people. By exploiting these moments of necessary vulnerability, the killers were able to demonstrate that no amount of power could protect a ruler from the basic requirements of human existence. The meal became a metaphor for mortality, the afternoon a symbol of the afternoon of life, and the casual conversation a reminder that trust could be fatal. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the Roman lunch hour murder tradition was how it evolved and adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character. In the early empire, assassinations were usually the result of palace conspiracies involving a small number of high-ranking officials who wanted to replace an unpopular emperor with someone more to their liking. The murders were typically carried out with daggers or short swords in private settings, and the killers usually tried to present the death as either justified tyrannicide or tragic accident. By the 3rd century, however, the pattern had become more militarized and public. Emperors were often killed by their own soldiers in military camps or on campaign, sometimes in front of entire armies who cheered the assassination and immediately proclaimed a new leader. The weapons had evolved too, while daggers remained popular for intimate betrayals, spears, arrows, and even siege engines were sometimes used when the goal was to make a dramatic public statement about the transfer of power. The rhetoric surrounding these murders also changed over time. Early imperial assassinations were usually justified in traditional Roman terms. The victim was a tyrant who had violated ancestral customs, or a weakling who had brought shame on the empire, or a madman who threatened the welfare of the state. Christian emperors, however, faced additional categories of accusation. They could be condemned as heretics who had corrupted the faith, as sinners whose immorality had offended God, or as false prophets who had led the faithful astray. These religious justifications for murder created new opportunities for ambitious rivals and made it even more difficult for emperors to maintain stable coalitions of support. The methods of assassination also became more sophisticated as the centuries passed. Early poisoners relied on crude plant extracts and mineral preparations that often failed to kill their targets or produced obvious symptoms that exposed the plot. Later practitioners developed more refined techniques, using slow-acting poisons that mimicked natural diseases, combination drugs that required multiple doses to be effective, or delivery systems that made detection nearly impossible. Some assassins became so skilled that they could kill an emperor while making his death appear to be the result of accident, suicide, or divine intervention. The Byzantine Empire, which inherited the Roman tradition of imperial murder, added its own innovations to the practice. Byzantine assassins pioneered the use of religious ceremonies as cover for political killings, murdering emperors during church services or religious processions when their guard was down. They also developed new forms of non-lethal elimination, such as blinding and castration, which removed rivals from contention without technically violating Christian prohibitions against murder. The elaborate court etiquette of Byzantium created new opportunities for assassination, as the complex protocols for approaching the emperor could be exploited by killers who knew the proper procedures. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Roman assassination tradition was how it influenced the development of political theory and constitutional thought. Ancient and medieval writers who studied the pattern of imperial murders gradually developed sophisticated analyses of the relationship between power, accountability, and survival. They noticed that emperors who ruled through fear and violence were themselves most likely to die violently, while those who governed through consensus and law were more likely to die natural deaths. They observed that the concentration of power in a single individual inevitably created incentives for that individual's elimination, and that the only reliable protection against assassination was the dispersion of authority among multiple institutions and officials. These insights eventually contributed to the development of constitutional monarchy, separation of powers, and other political innovations designed to prevent the concentration of deadly authority in the hands of any single person. The lunch hour murders also provided important lessons about the relationship between personal character and political survival. While some emperors were killed because they were cruel tyrants or incompetent administrators, others died simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time or because they trusted the wrong people. The randomness of many imperial deaths gradually convinced thoughtful observers that individual virtue and wisdom were insufficient protection against political violence, and that systematic institutional reforms were necessary to create stable government. This realization helped lay the groundwork for modern democratic theory, which assumes that political systems must be designed to function effectively regardless of the personal qualities of individual leaders. The influence of Roman assassination culture extended far beyond politics into literature, art, and popular culture. The dramatic nature of imperial murders, with their elements of betrayal, revenge, and divine justice, provided compelling material for historians, poets, and playwrights. Stories of emperors dying in their baths, choking on poisoned food, or being stabbed by trusted friends became archetypal narratives that influenced everything from Shakespearean tragedy to modern political thrillers. The image of the doomed ruler, surrounded by flatterers and enemies, became a standard figure in Western literature, while the treacherous advisor who smiles while plotting murder became an equally familiar character type. Even today, popular entertainment continues to draw on themes and images derived from Roman imperial assassination stories. Modern political dramas often feature powerful leaders who are betrayed by their closest associates, while spy novels and action movies regularly include scenes of poisoning, stabbing, and other intimate forms of political murder. The phrase, "Et tu, brute," has become shorthand for the ultimate betrayal, while terms like Praetorian Guard are still used to describe groups of officials or advisors who wield disproportionate influence over political leaders. The continued popularity of these themes suggests that the Roman experience of imperial assassination continues to resonate with contemporary audiences who live in very different political systems but who still recognize the fundamental tensions between power, loyalty, and survival that drove the ancient cycle of murder and succession. The Roman lunch hour murders also provide valuable insights into the psychology of political violence. The men who killed emperors were not, for the most part, psychopathic killers or religious fanatics, but rational actors who calculated that assassination was the most effective way to achieve their political goals. They chose their timing, weapons, and methods based on careful analysis of their target's vulnerabilities and their own capabilities. They understood that successful political murder required not just the ability to kill but also the ability to manage the aftermath, securing the loyalty of key supporters and eliminating potential rivals. This cold-blooded professionalism distinguished imperial assassination from other forms of political violence and made it a particularly effective tool for ambitious individuals who lacked the resources for open rebellion or civil war. The lunch hour murders reveal that political assassination, when practiced systematically over long periods, can become a form of governance in its own right. In the Roman system, the threat of assassination served as a crude but effective check on imperial power, ensuring that emperors who became too unpopular or incompetent would be removed before they could do irreparable damage to the state. While this system was obviously brutal and unstable, it did prevent the kind of long-term dynastic rule that might have led to even greater disasters. The constant turnover of emperors meant that no single individual or family could accumulate enough power to fundamentally alter the structure of the empire, and the need to maintain the loyalty of key supporters forced even the most autocratic rulers to pay attention to the interests of important constituencies. In this sense, assassination served as a substitute for the democratic mechanisms that did not exist in the Roman political system, providing a violent but effective form of accountability for rulers who might otherwise have been completely unrestrained. The study of Roman imperial assassination also illuminates the complex relationship between violence and legitimacy in political systems. While murder is obviously an illegitimate way to change governments by modern standards, in the Roman context it often served to restore legitimacy by removing rulers who had lost the confidence of key constituencies. The emperors who were killed were typically those who had violated traditional norms, failed in their military or administrative duties, or alienated important groups within the empire. Their deaths were often welcomed by significant portions of the population, who saw assassination as a necessary corrective to imperial excess or incompetence. This pattern suggests that legitimacy in political systems depends not just on legal or constitutional procedures but also on the continued consent of the governed, and that when formal mechanisms for expressing that consent are absent, informal mechanisms like assassination may emerge to fill the gap. The Roman experience thus provides a sobering reminder that violence can serve political functions in societies that lack adequate institutions for peaceful change, and that the elimination of political violence requires not just moral education but also the creation of effective alternative mechanisms for accountability and succession. As we reach the end of this long examination of Roman imperial assassination, it becomes clear that the lunch hour murders were not random acts of violence or historical curiosities but systematic features of a political system that concentrated enormous power in the hands of individuals while providing no legitimate mechanisms for constraining or removing them when they proved inadequate to their responsibilities. The patterns of timing, method, and justification that characterized these murders reveal sophisticated understanding of human psychology, political dynamics, and the relationship between power and vulnerability. The assassins who killed Roman emperors were not motivated primarily by personal hatred or mental illness but by rational calculations about the distribution of power and the need for political change. Their success in eliminating dozens of rulers over several centuries demonstrates that assassination, however morally objectionable, can be an effective tool for political transformation when other options are not available. The legacy of the Roman lunch hour murders extends far beyond the ancient world, influencing political development, constitutional theory, and cultural imagination in ways that continue to shape our understanding of power, legitimacy, and violence. The lessons drawn from this experience helped inspire the creation of modern democratic institutions designed to prevent the concentration of deadly authority in the hands of any single individual, while the stories and images derived from imperial assassinations continue to provide compelling material for literature, entertainment, and political analysis. Perhaps most importantly, the Roman experience reminds us that political violence is not an aberration or accident but a predictable consequence of certain types of institutional arrangements, and that the prevention of such violence requires careful attention to the design of political systems and the distribution of power within them. The emperors who died choking on poisoned wine, bleeding from stab wounds, or strangling in their baths were not simply victims of their own moral failings or the cruelty of their enemies, but casualties of a system that made their deaths almost inevitable. Their stories serve as warnings about the dangers of concentrated power and the importance of building political institutions that can survive the flaws and failures of individual leaders, while their afternoon meals serve as reminders that no one, no matter how powerful, can escape the basic vulnerabilities of human existence.